Apple is battling. Two major iOS developers and regulators are siding with the devs. You may know about the Apple versus Epic Games saga. We've talked about it here. Epic Games is planning to create a custom app store on iOS because Europe's DMA, the Digital Markets Act, has said that Apple now has to allow third-party app stores in the EU. So Epic created a developer account based in Sweden, and Apple actually approved the account 2 weeks ago. Then on Wednesday, Apple flipped, terminated Epic's EU developer account. And Apple said one of the reasons they terminated the account was because Epic CEO publicly criticized their DMA compliance plan. Additionally, on Monday, Apple was fined $2 billion by the EU's antitrust regulators and was forced to remove its anti-steering rules for music apps like Spotify. Basically, Apple has been restricting music apps from informing users about pricing and discounts. And the European Commission considered this anti-competitive since Apple runs Apple Music. And they want Spotify to pay 30%. Daniel Ek, friend of the pod, basically did a whole video on this about how they can't charge 30% more, yada, yada. Sachs, you've spoken about Apple's monopoly before. Your thoughts on what's happening in the EU, and then we'll get into Apple's wider problems.
I mean, did you just say that Apple booted Epic from their app store because they didn't like what Epic said about them?
I mean, their feelings were hurt.
Well, they're violating Epic's free speech because they don't like what Epic is saying. I mean,
according to Epic, yes.
This is crazily heavy-handed by Apple.
Apple heavy-handed with developers? Yeah.
Have they lost their minds? I mean, this is right out of Power Corrupts and Absolute Power Corrupts, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever dispute you have with Epic, you don't boot them out of your app store because you don't like their criticism of you. I mean, this is basically proving exactly what everyone's been saying about Apple, which is they're too powerful and heavy-handed. And Apple's coming along and saying, let me confirm it for you guys by acting tyrannically against Epic. Exactly. I mean, talk about a backfire. This seems insane to me.
Yeah, it's super nuts. Chamath, any thoughts on this before we get into Apple's other problems?
I think it's the beginning of the decay of Apple.
Peak Apple. Well, let's get into that. There's tons of headwinds facing Apple.
You can add a bunch of other things to the list as well, Jason.
Yeah.
The thing is, Apple for the last couple of years has been what is effectively what we call a GDP plus growth company, which means that take GDP, 2, 3, 4%. Maybe they can grow by a couple of percentage points more than that, but they are effectively levered to GDP, meaning when you look at a Facebook or an NVIDIA, they're growing at 50%, 200%, 2,000%, whatever it is. That's not tied to GDP. They're just taking share. But Apple is a company now that grows as the economy of the world grows. So that's not super great for its future prospects unless it can expand the surface area of where they operate. And then on that dimension, there are a few $1 trillion markets that they can really penetrate. And they just announced that they've killed a project in one of those areas, which is autos, right? Project Titan, which was $10 billion, turned out to be a failure. So all of these things, I think, mean to me that it is effectively becoming a cyclical, rate-sensitive stock. And then the coup de grace is Warren Buffett. And Nick and I were talking about it this week. And what was interesting about Buffett's letter is that you can tell when Buffett has gotten disengaged with a company based on the number of times he mentions it in his annual letter. So in this example, this is the number of times Apple was mentioned. And just to be clear, what I mean by mentions is not when it's included in a chart or part of a disclosure. What I mean is when Warren actually explicitly mentions it in a positive or even negative way, or he doesn't mention it at all, which I think rings very loudly. He went from basically saying Apple was the absolute end all and be all. And now what you can start to see is this shrinking. And it's gone from basically a bunch of times to almost none. He did mention it once, but he mentioned it in the context of talking positively about Coca-Cola and Amex. And he was lauding these two positions, but just mentioning that they were not as large in comparison to Apple. That's the only mention in this year's annual letter. What's interesting about that is the last time that happened was with, drumroll, Wells Fargo. Over 15 and 20 years, Buffett built up a huge position. I think he was able to weather the vicissitudes of the market. So even when the markets would contract, he knew when to hold on to that company. until he realized that that company was not really one of his forever stocks. And he got out of it. And the number of times it basically was mentioned in his letter went to zero. So interestingly, I think this Buffett index is a really important one for Apple, which is it went from a forever holding that he said he would own forever to barely getting mentioned. And above him, above Apple on that list were all the Japanese trading companies that Buffett owns, American Express, Coca-Cola. So that is a person that understands the economy, I think, better than anybody else in the world. And so if you're basically taking a levered bet to the economy as a reason to own Apple, and the person that understands the economy the most has now started to pivot away, he started to sell in Q4. And then you see all of these things, antitrust rules, killing projects in trillion-dollar TAMs. Unfortunately, it speaks for a very bad next 5 to 10 years for this company unless they figure something out.
I think it's just such a great insight with the Warren Buffett mentions. And we should do that forward looking. Like, who is he talking about now? And let's monitor when he stops talking about them. I have a theory about this. I think this is really just about peak iPhone. If you look at the majority of their revenue, it's obviously from the iPhone, which has become massively profitable over time. But the iPhone revenue has been flat for a couple of years now. And they're starting to make their money from services. Everybody knows Apple One, iCloud storage, Apple Arcade, Apple Music, Apple Plus TV. They've got a great collection of services, and services revenue is growing. But I don't think that they are filling in this growth problem with the iPhone. And this happened to me for the first time. And I don't know if you gentlemen have had the same experience, but I was buying every Apple phone, and then I would buy every like medium upgrade, like when they would do like a 12 and then a 12S or an 11, 11S. And when I got to iPhone 13, I was like, this thing's kind of peaked. And I just forgot to buy the 14, didn't need it. And then I bought the 15, and I'm sitting here with my 15 and my 13. I really couldn't tell the difference between them. And so now I'm a technologist who would buy it every year, the latest one, and I don't feel the need to upgrade it. And I think that a lot of people, and I have family members who would take 2 generations off. Now they take 3 or 4 generations off. So
I don't even know what number I'm on, you know?
I don't even know either. It all looks the same to me.
Okay. So, I mean, that's the problem here. And then if you look at their roadmap, what is the device post the Steve Jobs era that they have launched?
How do you know what device you have?
You go to general in your settings and I just checked it. I'm iPhone 13 Pro. What version are they on?
What is
15.
it? General?
They're on 15 and I'm on 13 Pro. I don't even know.
Yeah. And you're not price sensitive.
Yeah.
And these things have gotten absurdly expensive. So they're trying to really extract.
What is the latest?
15.
15. I'm on a 14.
I don't like the hassle of having to like reset everything when I get a new phone.
Yes. And it's easy to do now. It's like all in the cloud. But even that, going to the store, buying it, like who cares? It's not.
But then on my apps, I have to re-log in. And
Freeberg, what Android phone are you on? Oh, you're a Googler. Didn't the Googlers all have Android phones? Or are you your team iPhone?
I got the Macintosh original in 1984. I've only been on Macintosh and Apple products since then.
What iPhone are you on? Be honest.
15 Pro.
Okay. So,
have you ever tried a Pixel, Freeberg?
I don't like it. But I'm not used to the OS.
What was the rule at Google? If you worked at Google, were you kind of forced to have an Android phone, or did you just keep your iPhone in your pocket and not take out?
There weren't a lot of Androids on the market when I was at Google because we acquired the company when I was there we acquired Andy Rubin's company in 2004. And I think the first major devices started to roll out in 2007. And so this was all post my era. I left at the end of 2006.
Wow, Freeberg, that's an amazing chart. Holy.
So pull up this chart. Now, here's the global statistics. The US market share is 57% for iOS, but on a global basis, iOS only has a 27% market share in mobile operating systems. Android is 72%, and all other is less than 1%.
But look at this. It's all the future GDP is on Android. Brazil, Nigeria, India. Holy macro.
Well, but I think this is one counter to your point, Chamath, that the macro driver is as the economic position, the GDP per capita scales in these BRICS nations, they can start to afford to buy iPhones, which are generally some multiple of the Android devices in these markets that you see here. So while today Android is 72% of the market, if the emerging markets continue to grow GDP per capita and iOS continues to be the superior product, you'll see Apple able to steal into more share over time.
But how do you do that when you have messaging groups on Android, when you have photos in Google Photos? Does the switching cost stop that, do you think?
I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question.
They're down to $15 to $25 for these Android phones in India. There's a famous...
That's the difference.
Yeah.
Right, so these Android devices.
I think Apple is levered to GDP, global GDP. So they need to figure out some way to grow superior to that.
Like
so what is the market? What could they do?
Services?
A company that generally has a bunch of cash flow being generated by some set of products today, and you assume stasis, over time, the market share for those products could be eaten away. You'll see the profits per year go down. And a company like that will trade anywhere from 7 to 20 times. The technology value arises from the value of the brand, that you can launch new products, leverage your brand, leverage your distribution, leverage the sale of new services and new products. I think, to your point, Chamath, the challenge Apple is facing is that the pool of options, the portfolio of call options that you would get in new products coming out of Apple is shrinking.
Very limited.
With the car being taken out of that pool now, Apple Vision Pro, a lot of question marks on how much it can scale. As you guys know, I feel like there's going to be a market for that device, but it's a high-end device today. It has to become more cheap to be more ubiquitous.
The thing that a lot of these companies confront, though, is that you can also grow inorganically, right? You don't necessarily have to incubate these projects. We can remember the moment Apple had a chance to buy Tesla, right?
Didn't take it.
Then they didn't take it. Apple still has a chance to pick your company that would take a sweet acquisition offer, Rivian, Lucid, Polestar, whatever it is. I'm not saying that these companies are good or not good. I'm just saying that Apple has the one tool that they've never used in their toolbox is the large inorganic acquisition. And at this point, if they are proving that they can't execute internally, the market is going to demand that they prove they can use that balance sheet as a cudgel to go and execute it externally.
Yeah, I think
if they don't do that, they're going to discount that cash to zero.
The challenge is that there's a certain discipline and quality to the products and the businesses that Apple produces and runs. And it's very hard to see that in other markets. I mean, why would they go buy a money-losing, low-margin car hardware company when they are proven to make high quality?
On the reasons Project Titan failed.
Yeah.
The article in Bloomberg basically said that the reason that they abandoned the project was in part that they did not know how to go from where they were to a full production vehicle that could be level 5. And then when it was proposed that they step down and just launch a level 3 autonomous vehicle, everybody said no, that it wasn't disruptive enough. Well, if that's the case, the thing that they made a decision about there was not going into a market because of regulation, not because of technical capability. And I don't think that that's necessarily a smart decision. They would have been better off going into the car market, launching a level 3 vehicle and just letting the market play out. They probably, just like they were able to do in music, have the influence to change the laws.
Yeah.
Especially if they stepped in there with their rigor, right? And they're not doing that. So it's a little bit of a head scratcher what's going on over there.
Yeah. They need some new products. I mean, maybe Apple Vision Pro someday becomes the platform of the future, but they've squeezed as much revenue as they can out of the iPhone. Services seems like the best place for them to make money, but as we see,
my idea
the
for
App
them
Store
was
is under assault. Yeah.
My idea was just that they should launch a huge competitor to AWS, Azure, and GCP. So if you look, every developer that Apple has theoretically could have been running on an Apple, not just on Apple's SDK and APIs, but they should be running in an Apple cloud. You could have made that claim, and it would have made a ton of sense for app developers to have turnkey access to that, right? And they could have subsidized it. And by the way, to Sax's point, that would have been an incredible way to defend a 30% rev share. Okay, listen, I'm taking 30%, but here's a bunch of subsidized access to hardware. And the market would have loved it. And in this AI shift, they can still do that, where now people are chipping away at the 30%, right? People are saying, well, I can just build around you. They need to do something. In services, Jason, the most valuable thing they could do would be to launch a big cloud, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they have all the app developers on test flight ready to go.
All of them.
They just email them and say, hey, here's your free storage. I mean, they could just slowly add features, right? And they're doing this open source, I think it's called Maggie, or Magpie or something, but they're doing an image one. And
look, if they could just make Siri work like the way it was supposed to using an LLM and have it be like snappy, that'd be a major upgrade to the iPhone. I don't think you need to buy a new iPhone for that because it'd just be a software upgrade, but just getting Siri to work would be a big win.
I think that's where they're going with their silicon. And they just announced the M3 on the MacBook Airs. Like, they're making their own silicon. And I think it's going to power LLMs locally on the devices. And that's so powerful. I was using iPhoto this week, and in Apple Photos, there's now on certain images, if you swipe through them, you'll see the little AI icon. When you click it, it tells you things in the photo. Like, that's a bulldog, that's pasta. And so they're already subtly adding these features. Now, that's a feature Google's had in Google Photos for 5 years. But go ahead and open your phone right now and search for a dog or a bulldog or whatever type of dog you got, Labrador, and then watch Golden Retriever, that it actually knows how to do it. They never announced it. It's just subtly being put in there. There's so many opportunities.
If they required a hardware upgrade to get like actually good AI built into the software, then everyone's going to have to upgrade for that.
You'd be on
That's
16.
a pretty big motivation to upgrade.
There you have it, Tim Cook. Somebody send this clip to Tim Cook. Put AI chips on your phone.
But this isn't hard, right? I mean, all they got to do is just take the latest open source models and figure out how to customize them for their own products.
Yeah, and they're doing it. They're doing it right now.